In April 1940, the terror in Poland continues unabated. The Soviet NKVD are executing thousands in the forest in Katyn. The SS Einsatzgruppen continue rounding up Poles deemed to be a threat. Both sides are sending trainload after trainload of Poles to the gulags and concentration camps. In Łódź, the first ghetto for the Jews is walled off on April 30th. I'm Spartacus Olsson, and this is War Against Humanity, a special program of World War II in real time. In the previous episode, we spoke of the SS Einsatzgruppen at work in Poland, staffed by SS and Wehrmacht personnel and tasked with the arrest and execution of those deemed to be a potential threat to the German occupation and Nazi ideology. But the Einsatzgruppen are also singling out another of the Nazi targets for elimination, the Jews. In Germany itself, there has been a gradual reduction of the human rights of people of Jewish faith that started as soon as the Nazis came to power in 1933. Hitler is at first disappointed with the popular support to act swiftly and violently against the Jews. But by the autumn of 1938, the Nazis have managed to get momentum behind the non-Jewish Germans' willingness to either participate or at least tacitly accept physical violence and oppression of what is defined as the Jewish people. It is a process that social psychologist Harald Welzer has named Entsolidarisierungsprozess, the process of desolidarization between Jews and non-Jews. We will get back to this process in a few minutes. In Poland, for obvious reasons, they don't have to care about public opinion and get going with the implementation of the so-called final solution right away. Now, what this final solution means and when it turned into full-blown systematic mass murder was debated vigorously from the 1960s to the 1990s. It is debatable because Hitler never issued a clear written order to start the organized mass murder of Jews. However, since the 1990s, most historians follow a deterministic approach, looking less at the idea of documented intent or decisions and focusing on the succession of events that we will follow too. The basis for this is the massive evidence showing that in whatever way the decisions were made, in whatever order they were made, and whoever made them, they all followed the goals outlined by Hitler in his 30 January 1939 public speech when he said, "Today I will once more be a prophet. If the international Jewish financiers in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once more into a world war, then the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe." What that means and how to interpret that is an issue of contention within the Nazi Party. You can divide the views into three factions: the expulsionists, who believe that the best solution to reach Hitler's goal is the deportation of all Jews from Europe to, well, somewhere. The productionists, who believe that the Jews should be used primarily as slave labor. And finally, the attritionists, who believe that the solution to the Jewish question is to hoard them all into closed ghettos and simply let them die away. The actions of the SS in Poland in 1939 and early 1940 pretty much reflects exactly this debate. But they all agree on one thing: the Jews must be taken off the streets and quickly. On September 21st, 1939, Reinhard Heydrich, director of the Reich Main Security Office, who is in charge of dealing with the Jewish question, meets with the leaders of the Einsatzgruppen in Poland and his advisor for Jewish affairs, Adolf Eichmann, and instills urgency. The Jews are to be concentrated in ghettos, in cities, in order to facilitate a better possibility of control and later expulsion. No matter what the final solution is to be, it is urgent that the Jew disappears from the countryside. Thus, the initial concentration in cities, Heydrich insists, must be carried out within the next 3 to 4 weeks. He faces opposition from the Wehrmacht, who fear that this speed might create negative economic consequences. Under their pressure, on September 30th, he informs the Einsatzgruppen leaders that the timing of the Jewish concentration must continue without disturbing military interests. Nevertheless, the creation of the Polish ghettos proceeds, with the first ghetto created in Piotrków Trybunalski, around 40 kilometers southeast of Łódź, but inside the Generalgouvernement. The city has about 50,000 inhabitants, some 30% of them Jewish. However, it is the much larger city of Łódź to the north, just within the incorporated territories and next to the Third Reich, where the Nazis will finally conclude the model they will use for Ghettoization. Łódź, now renamed Litzmannstadt, is the largest city of Posen that the Nazis have now renamed Reichsgau-Vaterland, and has the largest community of Jews in the incorporated territory. The plan is to expel the entire population of 7.5 million non-German Poles and 500,000 Polish Jews out of the Vaterland to make room for ethnic Germans displaced from the territories ceded to Stalin in the Non-Aggression Pact. Again, the Wehrmacht protests for reasons of the upheaval to the economic output it will create, income they need to plunder to continue financing the war. In December 1939, it is decided that the immediate evacuation of the Łódź Jews is not possible, and Otto Greiser, the Gauleiter, or governor of Vaterland, agrees to seal them up temporarily in a closed ghetto. Greiser now has a new idea. He will starve the Jews in this ghetto and then force them to, quote, give back the wealth the Nazis imagine they have hoarded colossally in exchange for food. So the ghetto is to be a transition measure to extract the imagined wealth of the Jews, and then the SS will, quote, burn out this plagued boil so that the city will be cleansed of Jews, end quote. Greiser chooses the most squalid part of the city and starts forcing the Jewish population to move in there. German health officials also argue for the irrefutable necessity of hermetically sealing off the Jews who are deemed the carriers of epidemics, endangering the rest of the population. The Ghettoization decree is announced on February 8th, and some 162,000 Jews are then sealed off on April 30th, 1940. Greiser immediately proceeds to implement his plan. He has no interest in putting the ghetto population to productive work, only to rob them by seizing their property and through extortion by means of starvation. His plan doesn't return the expected results, when it turns out that extracting the hoarded treasures won't be that easy. You see, there isn't much in the way of treasure to be extracted. Greiser also has plans to increase his personal wealth in this way, and when he is disappointed by the results, he resorts to simply stealing 65% of any resources he receives to procure food and material for the ghetto. That the Jews wouldn't have immense hidden treasures simply doesn't compute with the Nazi worldview, and Greiser just chalks it up to harder resistance than he expected, and continues starving and harassing the Jews of Łódź inside his gigantic private torture camp. Now remember, we're talking of ordinary men, women, and children here. People who, like you and I, are just going about their lives, working for a living, plowing the fields, herding domestic animals, running their shops, commuting to the office or factory, people falling in love, breaking up, getting married, and forming families, loving their children, children playing innocently with toy cars and dolls, brooding teenagers facing puberty, dreaming of becoming grown-ups, and free parents and grandparents worrying about everyday problems and issues that will soon pale under the terror they are now to face. In Austria, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, many of them are desperately poor and oppressed even before the Nazis arrive on the scene. In Germany, they are slightly more accepted and assimilated into general society before 1933. Many of what the Nazis consider Jews don't even consider themselves Jewish. They just happen to have some Jewish ancestor along the way. All over Poland, these people now face Kaiser's and the rest of the Nazi administrators' willful torture, deprivation, and starvation. If they don't fall in line with the Nazi demands for subjugation, they are simply murdered or sent off to the concentration camps in Germany, where they face an even more extreme treatment. It is very hard to fathom how you can imagine these people to be a threat to anything. But you see, the Nazis are firmly convinced that they are fighting a secret race war against the Jews, who are supposedly hell-bent on pushing aside the German race, and somewhat paradoxically behind both robber capitalism and Soviet Bolshevism. You see, by the standards of the time, the Jews are viewed as a people, a race, a view that in 2019 is still prevalent in many parts of society, although we now know from countless genetic and genealogical studies that this is not scientifically correct. If you just go back only a few generations, there are too many common ancestors between all the people in any given region to make such a clear distinction. Sexual attraction is the great equalizer. In any case, at the time, this is not known, and there is even pseudo-scientific proof for the erroneous belief that all Jews are linked by immediate ancestry. For centuries, people of Jewish faith has been used as scapegoats for almost anything you can imagine: the plague, financial hardship, drought, wars, social upheaval, you name it. The Nazis take this anti-Semitic outlook to a new level, and from the very get-go, after the Great War, Hitler starts agitating against the Jews, blaming them for any ills that have befallen Germany, even blaming them for the loss of World War I, a war where countless Germans of Jewish faith fought, suffered, and died bravely and dutifully on the front for the fatherland, their fatherland. So bear with me for a few seconds when I state the painfully obvious. Neither Bolshevism nor capitalism is specifically connected to Judaism. Jews do not and have never hoarded treasure more than anyone else. No matter what one might imagine based on confirmation bias or anecdotal statistical fallacies, Jews do not control the media, politics, or banking. Even if there would be a Jewish conspiracy to dominate the world, it would be doomed to fail just by the numbers. There simply even isn't enough people of Jewish faith to carry out such a plan. On the eve of World War II, by the highest estimate, 0.7% of the world population is Jewish, assuming absurdly that they had an army or something. If every single Jew in the world would come together against Germany, they would be outnumbered 5-1. To control the global world of politics, finance, and industry would mean that every single adult Jew in the world would have to be a politician, banker, or captain of industry. But they don't have an army, and they are not the ruling class. They're just a tiny minority of ordinary people, out of which a disproportionate number are unfortunate enough to live right in the path of the Nazi war machine. You see, oppression, persecution, and mass murder of Jews has forced them to move around the Middle East and Europe for centuries. By the early 20th century, for a great variety of reasons, many Jewish families have ended up in Eastern Europe. Not that they are spared from oppression there, but still. In Poland, there is now an estimated 3.1 million Jews, which is 9.75% of the Polish population at the time. They are mostly subsistence farmers, poor tradesmen, craftspeople, and the lower middle class. They already face anti-Semitism and oppression by their non-Jewish Polish neighbors, and now the Nazis are convinced that this group, that has less power in Polish society than most other groups, is responsible for a war against the entire German people. You have to wonder how anyone can come to such absurd conclusions. The core Nazis are proponents of deeply rooted conspiracy theories and delusions already before the party is founded. They are also masterful at spreading these ideas and indoctrinating others. Unbeknownst to themselves, they apply the methods to influence people's emotions that in 2019 we have gained better understanding of how they work with our minds. As it turns out, it seems that our brains and the brains of all higher animals are hardwired with a basis for segregation and division. We've made a special video about the neurology of hatred. The link is in the description. But in short, it's like this. We naturally organize ourselves in us and them, whereby the definition of them is very tenuous and a weak conditioning that can be easily reverted by simply getting to know them. However, when confronted with them within the expected us-them context, we have a reflexive neural response that makes it more difficult for us to recognize them's face and individual traits, to empathize with them, and even process positive values and words in connection with them. The negative or positive emotions of the us-them response can be triggered by signals that have been associated to us or them, such as arbitrary colors on a piece of cloth that then take on the values of a national flag, religious symbols, clothing, or, as pertinent to the situation of the Jews in 1940, a yellow star. Last but not least, we have a part of the brain called the insular cortex that triggers disgust when we, for instance, bite into rotten food, smell fetid odors, or noxious gases. In humans, the insula can also be triggered by aesthetic or moral disgust. By associating them to things that we are usually disgusted by, like pests, filth, or disease, the us versus them response can be made so visceral that we feel disgusted by the sheer thought of what we believe to be them. At this point, we have lost the capacity to see any humanity in them that would usually trigger an empathy response. By the outbreak of the war, the relentless, insidious propaganda of the Nazis against the Jews, Poles, Slavs, anyone perceived as anti-Nazi, and many more, has achieved this with a large portion of the German people. So when the Wehrmacht and SS fall into Poland, they have less problems to overcome their natural inhibitions and have largely lost their ability to sympathize with their victims. Now that doesn't mean that these people have become mindless robots, and it doesn't exempt them from responsibility. Again, we know from anecdotal evidence and studies that even the briefest confrontation of sameness can reverse these effects more or less instantly. But the Nazis have been honing their skills at systematic, murderous oppression for 6 years by 1939. It is a formalized method of dehumanization and humiliation they have formed into the concentration camp system. Now, we will cover how this develops in more detail in between two wars, but some of it is essential to understand the scope of what will now happen. The camps are born more or less instantly in January 1933 when the Nazis come to power. It's an ad hoc creation of internment camps organized more or less simultaneously by the SA and local Nazis to handle the needs of space to meet the party's goal to incarcerate any perceived political enemies and anti-Nazis. This system of Schutzhaft, or protective custody, is also quickly appropriated by Nazi officials as a personal tool for extortion and robbery. By 1934, somewhere between 80 and 100,000 individuals have been incarcerated. Although most of them have been released after days or weeks, thousands of dissidents and undesirables remain in the camps under atrocious conditions, exposed to the willful violence, even murder, of the goons that run the camps. By late 1934, the system of concentration camps is consolidated under Heinrich Himmler's SS in the IKL, Inspektion der Konzentrationslager, the Concentration Camp Inspectorate. This department is created by Theodor Eicke, the SS officer in charge of Camp Dachau near Munich, one of the first formal camps. There, Eicke develops the so-called Dachau model, which is eventually applied to the whole system. The Dachau model rests on the principle that the camps are first and foremost tools of intimidation, torture, and incapacitation. He has done away with any form of meaningful forced labor. Instead, the inmates do meaningless, physically excruciating work such as just cracking stone with hand mallets or moving gravel back and forth for hours, days, and weeks on end. He implements a strict regimental control of the camps modeled on a vicious, meaningless form of martial discipline. He takes great pleasure in personally flogging inmates that don't fall in line, sometimes whipping them to their death. All of his victims are kept on restricted rations so that they are constantly near starvation or even starving. Sanitary conditions are awful, and many die from disease, exhaustion, and wounds inflicted by the torturous circumstances. He instigates a system of prisoners as guards and administrators in a deliberate effort to avoid any fraternizing between the SS men and their victims, which also pits the inmates against each other, further destabilizing their resistance potential. Although Jews are locked up in the camp simply for being Jewish only as of 1938, from the get-go, any prisoners that happen to be Jewish are singled out for special humiliation, forced to do permanent latrine duty, work on the Shabbat, and made subjects to constant special harassment. The Gulag system in the USSR follows similar ideas, although it lacks the industrial effectiveness instilled by Eicke and Himmler. In April of 1940, countless Poles deemed as threat to the occupiers who have avoided the execution squads of the SS and NKVD are headed either to the Gulags if they happen to be under Soviet occupation, and if they're under the Nazis, to the concentration camps. There simply isn't enough place for all the Polish Jews there, so for now they will stay in the ghettos. And as unimaginable as it is, the concentration camps would be an even worse fate. This is what the survivors among the 4,500 Polish victims interned in Buchenwald in October 1939 will eventually tell us of what they faced there. Even during unloading, we were worked over in the most brutal way with blows from rifle butts and kicks. Men, women, and children threw stones at us and shouted, "Strike them dead, the Polish pigs, the snipers." The camp gate closed behind us. We went into the so-called little camp. Almost every day, Deputy Commandant Otto Rödel visited us with his sidekicks. He always brought the whipping block along. Comrades were pulled out indiscriminately, strapped to the whipping block, and whipped until the flesh fell off in scraps. When one SS executioner became tired, he was replaced by another. Amidst these unspeakable torments and the starvation, dysentery began to rage amongst us. Each day demanded new victims who had to be laid out in rows next to the tents. At the beginning of the camp, the 4 tents were filled to overflowing with prisoners, but we were so decimated by the end of December 1939 that all inmates of the camp scarcely filled half a tent. In mid-January 1940, the evacuation of the little camp began at the urging of the prisoner orderlies in the hospitals. We joined our comrades in the large camp, where new sufferings awaited us.